So we have a Makefile set up now, and it's easy for us to start and stop our application, and it's time to get back to working with the database. Now right here in main.go, when we open our connection to the database and get this variable db on line 35 in my code, we actually want to close that when we're done with it. And of course, we're not going to be done with it until we stop the application. Now we got this variable right in the main function for our application, which is fine for our purposes. So let's just put this command right here. We'll say defer db.close. And the defer command, as I'm sure you know, will not execute whatever follows it until the current function finishes executing. And that means our application stops. So technically speaking, because I've started and stopped the application several times while my Docker database is running in the background, there are probably some connections floating around that aren't going to close for a little while. And that is what we call a resource leak. And we want to avoid that sort of thing. So this deferring of db.sql.close will actually take care of that for us. When the application stops, before it stops, it'll run this command and close those connections. So that was easy enough. The next step in our process is to set up some models in Go that will correspond to the tables that we have in our database. And right now we just have one. So over in the internal folder, not in the driver folder, but in the internal folder, I'll create a new folder, and I'm going to call it data. And that's where I'll put my database models. Now, you could, if you wanted, put these database models right in the main package, and that would work just fine. The problem with that, of course, is that right now, this code base is being used just to build an API. But at some point down the road, I might want to create a web interface to the API, right in this same body of code. And of course, that means I would create a cmd/web folder and put its main function in there and compile a binary using that. So I would write to go build-o, whatever I want to call the executable, and then ./cmd/web. And if I put my models here in the data folder, the same way I did with the driver in its own package, I can share that code between both the API and whatever web front end I might want to build down the road. So this is just planning for the future. So I'll create a new file in here, inside the data folder, inside the internal folder, and I'll call it models.go. Okay? And the package will be data, and I'll just set up some models. So the first one I'll set up is, to correspond to the one table we have in the database, type user. And I'm going to use this singular case for this, not users plural. And it's just a struct. And it, of course, has to have values that correspond to what we have in the database. So we have ID, for example, which is just an int. And in JSON, I'm going to call that ID lowercase. And then we had email, which is a string. And in JSON, I'll call that email. And first name, which is a string. And in JSON, I'll call that first_name. And we had last name, which is a string. And in JSON, I'll call that last_name. We also had password, which is a string. And in JSON, I'll call that password. And we had created_at, which is a time.time. And I'll let my IDE do the import for me, and it did. And in JSON, I'll call that, say, created at. And I'll duplicate that and change this to updated at. And change this to updated at. Okay, so let's save this. And that'll format it for me. Now, are there any other changes I want to make here? Yes, there are. I'm going to add omit empty for this one and for this one. So make it sure it's inside the double quotes, comma, omit empty. Password has to be there. Created_at and updated_at also have to be there. So I'll leave those ones alone. And email has to be there and ID has to be there. Perfect. So there is our user struct. Now we're also going to have some means of sending information back to the client that says, yes, you're authenticated. Because we're building a REST API. And a REST API, by default, doesn't keep track of state. And it's not supposed to. So In other words, when someone authenticates, we're going to send them a token of some sort, and that token has all the information necessary to keep track of their session and all the other things they might be doing. So we're going to be sending one more bit of information back, and that, of course, will be a token of some sort, which means I'm going to add the type token to the user type. Now, that, of course, means I need to create a table for tokens, and I also need to define the model for that token. So we'll take care of that in the next lecture.